All right, so welcome back everybody, Mr. Hayes again, and we're going to move on to our next video, and this is where we will discuss the more advanced questions. So let's go back to the other question, which is called get to it right here, which is called a checkbox grid. And what that does is that allows you to basically set up a question like this and let them respond individually to each of the choices. So here I have all of these choices for like a PTO, but here again I have all these choices, but now you have the option of putting yes. And the reason I do it this way sometimes is because if I go into my sample question form, I'm answering yes for this family reading night, or I'm answering yes for box tops, and I'm answering yes for STEAM. So I'm telling the person who is collecting the information what I'm interested in. And then in turn, when they come to look at the responses, let me get to here. I'll close this up a little bit. Now, I can see how many of my families are interested, for example, in reading night, or how many of my families are interested in the trunk or treat. So this tells me specifically by each one of those areas. So this question is really good for asking basically the same question about a lot of different topics and then getting the individual results so that I can easily filter them out and say, because if I'm going to do family interest night and I want to say who is interested in family reading night, I can filter out, and we'll get into the filtering a little bit later, but I can quickly see these three families want it. And then I can select them all again. But if I want to know who was interested in trunk or treat, I can just see that those two families were interested. So that's a really nice tool. So a lot of times when you're doing your questions, you have to think about what your data is going to be afterwards. The next question I'd like to talk about is called the multiple choice grid. It's very similar to the checkbox grid in that you have rows and columns, so you can have multiple options with multiple criteria, but whereas in a checkbox you can select multiple answers within the column, in a multiple choice grid you are limited to only choosing one per sample item. So if I scroll down to here where we've got the multiple choice grid, so if I wanted to choose how interested I was in these different options, I can pick not interested in family reading night, or somewhat, or very, but not all three, which is important because you want them to be limited to one of those. And then as they go forward, they can continue. So they can select here multiple somewhat interested, but they're limited to one of those choices per. And also has the ability to clear it all so that if they want to redo their choices, they have that ability. Another example of that would be when you're choosing first, second, and third. Now, this is where we'll get into some of the restrictions you can put on questions. So in the three dots, and we haven't talked about these very much yet, but in the three dots, you have some choices. And let me go to the first, second, third here. So in the multiple choice, in any of them, you have some restrictions that you can put on. So we've talked about the description, but here we have limit one response per column. And what that does is that means then only one of these can be chosen. So in the example of first, second, and third, you don't want multiple firsts. So let me refresh here. And we'll go, so now if I pick first for family reading night, I can no longer, of course it's going to do that. Let me hold on a second here. Reload that. Let's see. There, it's just at the bottom here. So it says, please do not select more than one response per column. So I can't pick more than one, and it won't let me submit the form like that. And that's where this clear selection comes in play. So I can pick a first, a second, and a third, but I can also uncheck it that way if I decide that this is going to be my third instead, and so forth. So that allows you to make sure that you can't overdo the responses. So the other option that you have in terms of making sure that they answer the questions correctly is that there is no required for an answer, but you can require a response in each row. So what this does then is it will not allow them to skip any of the questions. So if I reload here, and I believe it's this one question here, now it says this question requires one response per row. So once I've filled in, and it doesn't matter where they are, but once I fill them in, and every row has a response, then I'll be able to submit that form. That wouldn't be something you'd want to do in here because they would conflict with each other. Whereas I can't pick a response for every row because I can only pick 3 responses and there's more than 3 choices. So making sure that you don't kind of put your form user in a conflict where they can't fill out the form. And I'll just say this now, and I'll probably say it again. It's always good to go through your form and test it out as a user would use it. See if it makes sense. Maybe even have somebody else fill it out if you have time, just to kind of give you some feedback, because what you are intending may not always be what comes across to the user. So make sure that you do that. So let's keep moving on here now. So we've talked about the multiple choice and the checkbox grid. I want to say checks mix. But anyway, so some of our remaining questions that we have here. Oh, I just added a question here, didn't I? So some of our remaining questions here that we have are the date. You get a date stamp every time that you have a form submitted, but if you're looking for maybe a date in the future, a date question is nice because it's formatted. So it makes them select from, you can do it from a calendar, which is really nice because then they know they type in the right date. Or they can type it in, but they can select it, so then you know you're getting a right date. Somebody doesn't actually, slip up and type, 2020 or something like that. It's validated. The time. So in your choices for time, you can pick the time. So it'll be a AM PM time, or you have a duration. So they can put a set amount of time. So how long would it take? I haven't used that one as much. But you have that option. In the date, you also have an ability to add the time to it. I like to keep them separate because otherwise, when we talked about putting answers in the same cell, it puts the date and time in the same cell. So this is a little bit nicer so that they're separated. So I use the date and time. And then the last one that we haven't talked about yet is called the linear scale. So that's this one here. Oh, and we'll get to the file upload in a second. So the linear scale is basically like a rating scale. How good or poorly do you like something? You can go all the way up to 10, and you put what your top and bottom end, and you can use any words. Those are just, those are completely up to you. And then it will list it here. And again, they can only pick one of those choices. So, kind of be descriptive. You have the ability to put the description in there. I've even done it where I put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I list out what all of the different options are, even though it only shows 1 and 5. So the very final question I want to talk to you about is the file upload. Now the file upload is and it says right here, files will be uploaded from the owner's Google Drive, or will be uploaded to the form owner's Google Drive, Respondents will be required to sign in to Google when the file upload questions are added to a form. Make sure to share this only with people you trust. And so the reason they say that is because they can, essentially there's some restrictions on what files they can, but you don't want to, get anything uploaded maliciously. But they do have to have a Google account. So adding a Google file upload is a really nice option, but when you do it, they have to be able to sign into Google so that their information is tracked. So you go ahead and say continue on that. And that'll load the question. So you can answer the question, and here you can specify what types of files. So if I click on that, it'll give you the choices of what files are allowed. So you could pick that, say you only want PDF files, that kind of thing. The maximum number of files, this means how many files can the user attach. The maximum file size, so how big can that file be when they upload it. So depending on if you're taking just pictures, 10 megabytes for one picture is a pretty good amount, so you wouldn't need to necessarily change that. But if you're taking video, you may be looking at 100 megabytes or more. I mean, some of those files can get kind of big. Knowing that, you have to understand that the forms are set to initially only capture or upload so much in space or so much in file size. So right now, if I selected 100 megabytes, that 1,000 megabytes is 1 gigabyte. So if we do our math here, that means only 10 movie files of 100 megabytes could be uploaded before the form stops accepting. So if you're worried about that, you can actually change by clicking on there, and then you can increase your file size to how much you want them to be able to upload. But if you don't, like I said, if you increase this to like 10, like now it's saying that you can't even accept any because you have only limited it to 1 gigabyte and you're accepting up to 10 gigabyte files. So that's a nice one if you have like students and you want to have them upload things into a form. Again, Google Classroom might cover some of that already, but just wanted to kind of make you aware of the file upload and some of the options. And again, if you have any questions about these, feel free to reach out to me. But all of these files that are uploaded are attached with a link to the Google Drive, to the spreadsheet that we will look at, and there's a folder where it will store everything and it will be assigned to a name and things like that. So that's all I'm going to cover on questions for right now. In our next video, we will talk a little bit about adding some details or some organization to your form.